Welcome to Sunrise Online. During the month of May, we want to share a special video series with you from Pastor Jimmy Carroll of Journey Church that he filmed while he was in Israel. This will give you a glimpse into where Jesus lived. We hope this is an encouragement to you.
Life is a series of ups and downs. We are constantly being prepared for our next assignment, being prepared for our next mission. Now, I get it. We love life on the mountaintop. We love to celebrate. We love when everything's good. But the reality is that being on a mountaintop doesn't prepare you for your next mission. Where you get prepared for your next assignment is in the valley. It's in the wilderness. It's in the times when things aren't easy, when you don't know how you're going to make it through what you're going through. And it's in those seasons where our faith is deepened and we learn to trust. You got to remember that God has your best interest at heart. He's going to do a work in you so He can do a work through you. I'm standing on the roof of a monastery in Israel at a place called Mount Carmel. And I chose this location because when I think about preparation and obedience and sacrifice and commitment, someone being prepared for their next assignment, their next mission, I can't think of anyone who captures that more than the prophet Elijah. This monastery was, of course, built on the site where Elijah rained fire down from heaven. But long before he would ever rain fire down from heaven, long before he would raise a little boy from the dead, long before he would be called up into heaven in a chariot of fire, God would have to prepare him. He would have to get him ready, and it wasn't a fun season. It wasn't an easy season. And now Israel, during this time, was going through the period where they had kings. Now remember, prior to this, they went through the period of the judges. Their relationship, the Jewish people, their relationship with God has always been sort of a cycle of rebellion, and then God would judge them, and then they would cry out for mercy, and then He would redeem them. He would somehow set them free. So they went through the period of the judges, but then they said they wanted a king. And God said, "I'll be your king." And they said, "No, we want a real king." And so you remember Saul was the first king of Israel. Well, when Elijah comes onto the scene, the king of Israel is a wicked man named Ahab. His wife, by the way, her name was Jezebel. Please never name your daughter Jezebel. I can't imagine that being a godly, virtuous woman with a name like that. I hope nobody has a child named Jezebel. But the king during this time is a very wicked king. He's very much displeased the Lord. As a matter of fact, 1 Kings 16:30 gives us some insight into King Ahab, and it just says that Ahab did evil in the sight of the Lord. If you wanted to look at 1 Kings 16:33, it says that he was worshiping. He was leading God's people to worship the god of Asherah, which was the goddess of motherhood and fertility. And so God raises up His prophet, Elijah, to go confront the king and queen on how they had led God's people to rebellion. He raises Elijah up, and Elijah is going to pronounce judgment on Israel. Now, before we look at that, we don't know a lot about how Elijah grew up. We don't have a lot of background information on his childhood and his family life. We don't know much about that. It's as if he explodes on the scene. Now we know obviously God had been preparing him and doing a work in his life to get him ready for this moment that we're about to read, but we just don't have the information on that. So our first look at Elijah is in 1 Kings 17, 1 through 7. Let's read that together. Now Elijah, the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead, said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall neither be dew nor rain these years except by my word." And the word of the Lord came to him, "Depart from here, turn eastward, and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." So he went and did according to the word of the Lord, and he went and lived by the brook Cherith, that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening. And he drank from the brook, and after a while the brook dried up, because there was no rain in the land. The word Cherith is an interesting word. It means to separate. Now, east of where I'm standing would be behind me. So somewhere behind where I'm standing, God sent him to this brook Cherith, which means to be separated. It means to separate. God would supernaturally provide for him. He didn't send him there to starve. He sent him to a dry place, a place to be alone, to be separate, to become desperate for God. And God would provide for him in this place of separation. Stop for a minute and think about the questions that Elijah must have had. If I'm Elijah, my attitude is, well, wait a minute. I just confronted the most powerful person in the world. You just used me in an amazing way. I'm ready for my next assignment. That's what I would have been thinking. And you want to send me to be alone and be fed by some ravens. You want to separate. I don't get it. And sometimes when God calls us to do something and we get in that dry place, we get in that season of preparation, we don't understand everything, but we're not God. We don't know what he's getting ready to do. That's why we just have to trust him. So we see that he asked these questions. He must have. He was human, and those are fair and familiar questions for those of us who have spent any time at the dry brook. There's a principle I want to teach you here before we move on. Faith always leads to obedience. Faith always leads to obedience. Notice the sequence of events. There was a command, there was obedience, then there was the miracle. That's not how we like it, is it? We like the command, then we like the miracle, then we will obey. We don't mind God telling us to do something. We just want him to show us the end from the beginning. We want to see the consequences of our choices before we make them. We want to know that he's going to come through and provide, and then we'll move forth. But that's not the Christian life. That's not the life of faith. Now, back to Elijah. Most people believe that he spent at least 2 years in this place of isolation, this place being separated. And we know that the brook eventually dried up. Well, God eventually said to Elijah, your time in the place of separation, your time in the dry place, the dry brook is now over. I want you to leave the brook Cherith, and I want you to go about 17 miles from where we're standing right now. I want you to go about 17 miles to this place called Zarephath. And there you're going to find a widow and her son. Zarephath is north of here, and Elijah at the brook would learn that God can take care of me. That was the lesson that Elijah learned at that dry brook. Now, at Zarephath, he's going to learn a different lesson. He's going to learn the lesson that God can use me to take care of someone else. Elijah learned that faith is synonymous with obedience, and he's about to give this widow an opportunity to learn the exact same lesson. Elijah would end up being used by God to help thousands of people, but before he could do that, he had to learn the importance of taking care of one. If you have a Bible, you can look at 1 Kings 17, 8 through 24. We don't know all that there is to know about this widow. We don't know how her husband died. We don't know when he died. What we know is that there's been a famine in the land. And this poor widow, this poor mother is hungry. We know she's afraid. We know that she's destitute and despondent. She's as low as anyone could be. And here comes Elijah to town. He comes to her and he wants her to fix him something to eat. This is a life and death decision for this widow. She's either going to trust what the man of God is saying, or she's going to trust what she can see. Let's notice together 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 13 and 14. Let's look at this together. And Elijah said to her, "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth." So Elijah shows up to Zarephath and tells this widow that before you make anything for you or your son, I want you to take care of me first. We have to stop here, and I have to teach you another principle. This story teaches us the principle of first fruits. God doesn't want your leftovers. He doesn't want your second choice. He doesn't want to be your last resort. He wants to be first. He wants your first, and He wants your best. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 6:33, "Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. Then all these things will be added to you." He wants to be first in every part of your life. He wants to be first in your priorities. He wants to be first with your time, with your thoughts, and of course with your finances. Now we're going to see how the widow responded. This is a moment of truth for her. This is a moment of truth. Let's look at how she responded in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 15 and 16. "And she went and did as Elijah said, and she and he and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that He spoke by Elijah." She could have responded by saying no. She could have responded with fear. She could have said, "I can't afford to give," but she didn't do that. She said, "I can't afford not to give. This is all I have left. This is my last chance. I'm going to trust the man of God." Her faith led to her having more than enough to eat and drink. But not only this, if you, on your own time, go and read verses 17 through 24, what you read is that her son died. And Elijah was literally able to go raise her son from the dead. So think about it. Her faith, which again, faith always leads to obedience. Her faith and obedience not only led to her having unlimited provision for her family, but it actually led to life for her son. Now Elijah is ready for his next assignment. He's confronted Ahab. There's a famine in the land. God separated him for at least 2 years in a dry place, preparing him for his next assignment where he would be used by God to bless this widow and her son. And now he's ready for the biggest challenge of his life. He's ready for the story that brings me to this spot today. You can read about it in 1 Kings chapter 18. Elijah is called by God to return to Ahab. Now remember, it's been 3 years since the last time he confronted Ahab, and the famine is now over. When Elijah comes to Ahab, he discovers that God's people are trying to have it both ways. They're trying to worship God. They're trying to worship idols. They're trying to have one foot in the world and one foot with God. And Elijah has been prepared for 3 years for this moment. And he's here to issue a wake-up call. By the way, this wake-up call that he issues God's people is still relevant today. Some of you may be watching this right now, and maybe the whole reason you're watching this is for this call, this issue, this issued warning that we're about to read. Maybe it's the whole reason that you're watching this message today. Notice with me in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 19. Let's look at this together. Now therefore, send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Do you get the scene? You get the setting? He calls all the people of Israel, Ahab, all the false prophets, and he brings them up on this mountain. And he's got their undivided attention. And let's notice this warning that he issues, this call to make a choice. Let's notice it together. Look at verse 21. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you go on limping between two different opinions? Here it is. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. That's it. That's it. That was the word for God's people. And it's the word for some of you watching this right now. Either he's God or he's not. If he's God, then follow him and stop playing games. Stop being religious and just attending church, trying to be a good person. If he's God, then go all in. And if he's not, then stop pretending. That's a great word. That's still relevant even today. Now, let me explain the challenge. Elijah, around all those people, the prophets of Baal, the king, the queen, all of God's people. Here's what Elijah says. He says, what I want you to do is, you false prophets, I want you to build an altar, and I want you to get a sacrifice, put it on the altar, and then I want you to pray to your gods, and I'm going to do the same. I'm going to rebuild the altar because it's been destroyed. I'm going to rebuild the altar of God's people. I'll do a sacrifice, and whichever God rains fire down from heaven, that's the God that we will know is the one true God. So that's the challenge that he issued. Now, let's notice 1 Kings chapter 18, beginning in verse 25. Let's notice this together. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose for yourselves one bull and prepare it first, for you are many, and call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it. And they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. By the way, that's because Baal's a false god. But anyway, there was no voice and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. And at noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he's a god. Either he's musing, or he's relieving himself, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened. And they cried aloud and cut themselves with their customs, with swords and lances, until the blood gushed out of them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of oblation. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. So you get the scene, right? Elijah said, you guys go first. They built their altar. They did the sacrifice. And they started crying and screaming so loud. And of course, nobody answered because Baal's a false god. There's no such thing. And my favorite part of the story is when Elijah starts mocking them. You have to know, put yourself in this scene. You have to know that when this challenge is issued, I mean, he's the only one up there representing God. He's on an island by himself. There had to be a part of him that doubted. There had to be a part of him that when he issued the challenge that God had told him to issue, there had to be a part of him that was like, I hope Baal doesn't rain fire down from heaven. I don't want that to happen. But then as the longer time went on, he started getting a little cocky about it. He started getting a little arrogant about it, and he started mocking them. And he says, hey, why don't you cry a little louder? Maybe your God's sleeping, or maybe he's in the bathroom. And they started cutting themselves. And finally, it's now Elijah's turn. It's obvious that their God is not going to answer. So now it's Elijah's turn. And let's notice together in verse 30 of chapter 18. Let's look at this. Then Elijah said to all the people, come near to me. And all the people came near to him. And he repaired the altar that the Lord had been that had been thrown down. And Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, Israel shall be your name. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar, as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. And he put wood in order, and cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. And he said, fill 4 jars with water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. And he said, do it a second time. And they did it a second time. And he said, do it a third time. And they did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar and filled the trench also with water. Man, can you even believe that? Can you even imagine this scene? Elijah by himself, just he and God. He rebuilds the altar. He puts the sacrifice on the altar. Not only that, but he pours water on his sacrifice. They built a trench around the altar. He poured water. He said, do it a second time. He said, do it a third time. They put so much water on the sacrifice and the altar that it filled the trenches and was overflowing. This is a man who has gone all in with God. This is a man who has put it all on the line. Let's see what happened. Look at verse 36. And at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that these people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. Can you even imagine what it would have been like to be here that day? Elijah's all in. He cries out, God, would you please come through? Will you do the miraculous? Will you show these people that you are the one true God? And man, he did just that. He rained fire down from heaven. It not only consumed the sacrifice, it consumed the altar. It consumed the stones around the altar. It consumed all the water in the trench. And when the people of God saw what had happened, they once again turned their faces back to God. They cried out in repentance, the Lord, He is God. You know, for Elijah, this would not be his final assignment. This wouldn't be it. There would be other missions to accomplish. There would be other seasons that he would go through. There would be a lot of ups and downs. God would use him in an amazing way. God would use him to do really amazing miracles. But before he could use him on this day, remember that he had to get him ready. Don't forget that he spent 2 years at a dry place, separated. Don't forget that he spent time with the widow and her son. Of course, today, what happened on this mountain, that showdown where God rained fire down from heaven, of course that was amazing. Of course, Elijah was honored and blessed, and he could have never dreamed that God was going to use him in that big of a way. But it didn't start on that day. It started in those previous years of separation and isolation and preparation. His faith always led to obedience, and God used him in a way that was so big that Elijah could never have dreamed it possible. Today, some of you are in a dry place. Some of you are in a valley right now, and you don't like it. You would have never chosen it for yourself. I want to tell you to hold on. God's getting you ready. That's what He's doing. He's preparing you for something better. He's preparing you for a new mission. What He's going to do through you, you don't even think you're capable of doing. But He's got to get you ready for that. That's not going to happen today. Today is a process and a season of preparation. He has not forsaken you. He has not forgotten you. He's using everything in your life to conform you to the image of His Son, Jesus. He's using everything, every circumstance, every financial decision, every relationship. He's using everything in your life to get you ready for what He's getting you ready for. One of my favorite verses is 2 Corinthians 12:9. But He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me.